again, and welcome back to my kitchen. Today I would like to do kind of an introductory video on pressure canning using a Miro 12 quart canner. Now the Miro canners have different features than the Presto canners do. So if you have a Miro canner and you've never used it before and you would like to become a little bit more familiar with how it works and how to maintain it, stick around and I'll show you how that's done. Now my Miro canner is actually pretty old. I've used this thing for years. I just recently found another one on Facebook Marketplace, and you better believe it was a good price, and I snatched that up because these are good little canners. The one drawback with the Miro canner is because it is a smaller canner, you can't double stack like what you do in a Presto canner, but everything else, you know, the safety is the same, everything else is the same. Miros are really good little canners. They do have a little bit different weight system than what the Presto weight or regulator looks like also, but I'll introduce you to all of that later on in the video. So first of all, I want to go over some of your just regular routine maintenance things that you need to do occasionally to keep your pressure canner in good functioning condition. When you remove the lid of your canner, you will see that much like the Presto, the Miro canner has a removable lid gasket, okay? It's always important to keep these in good condition. So I suggest washing them. Whenever you wash your canner up, take your gasket out and wash it up also. And it's super, super important to keep this rubber nice and supple. Rubber, as we all know, it dries out and it can crack. And rubber can also shrink. As it dries out, it shrinks. So if you notice that your gasket is not fitting nice and tight inside of your lid and it moves around a little bit, here's a few tips for you, okay? You can take this gasket out and soak it in a sink of hot water for about 15 minutes to a half hour. And sometimes that will restore the moisture enough so that it will expand a little bit and fit in your lid more like what it should. Now another thing is occasionally oil your gaskets, okay? Clean your gasket and oil it. Now how I do this is I just take a little bit of vegetable oil or sunflower oil or even safflower oil. The one oil that I tend to stay away from with my pressure canners is olive oil. I know a lot of people do suggest using olive oil, but in my experience, if you've ever fried something up in a hot frying pan using olive oil has a lower, what they call a flash or burn point. And olive oil tends to get really sticky when it is exposed to extreme temperatures. And when you're pressure canning, you are at extreme high temperatures. And so I tend to stay away from olive oil. I prefer to use vegetable oil or, like I said, like sunflower or safflower oil. So after your, now I suggest that you do this depending on how often you can. At least do this once a year. If you're just one of those canners that maybe you only can seasonally, you're bringing in large amounts of vegetables from your garden, and that's the one time a year that you do a lot of canning, I suggest that you do at least oil all of your rubber parts once a year. Now, if you're a canner like me who cans year-round, you really need to be doing this a lot more often than just once a year. Sometimes I do it 3 and 4 times a year. Whenever you are storing your canner for long periods of time, I do suggest that you clean and oil your gasket ring before you put it into storage. Also, when you are storing your canner, make sure that, I'm going to just slip this back in here, make sure that you are not actually storing your canner with the lid on and locked in position, because what you are doing is you are compressing that gasket seal through months and months and months, and you're squishing it and compressing it, which will mean that your gasket probably is not going to hold a tight seal the next time that you use your canner. So what I do is I clean and I oil my gasket, and then when I'm storing my canner, I actually store my lid upside down, so there's absolutely no pressure on that gasket seal at all. So we'll just get back to this gasket seal at this point in time. And what I do is I clean it really well, I wash it up really well, rinse it and dry it. And then I just take a little bit of vegetable oil just on my fingers and I just run it around that gasket seal, all right? Just oil it up. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of oil, but just, you know, get it really nice and well covered. Re-dip your fingers and get a little bit more oil on there. Doesn't, like I said, it doesn't really take a whole lot, but this is just a really good thing to maintain your seals this way, so that they don't crack and dry out. You know, they age a little bit slower this way. So, and the better that you take care of your canner, the better your canner is going to take care of you. So give it a little love, give it a little attention all the way throughout the year. Okay, so after I have coated that really well with my oil, then I just take just a paper towel and I just kind of wipe off the excess, okay? You don't have to get it super, super dry, but just wipe off the excess. You're not looking for a thick layer of oil on here. You're just conditioning this rubber is all you're doing. And after you've done that, then go ahead and replace it in your lid. And it just slips right in there, quick and easy, okay? Now, another thing about maintaining any kind of a pressure canner, but today I'm talking about the Miro, is every time you use your pressure canner, you want to make sure that your weight stem is clear and not blocked. Sometimes calcium and lime from hard water can sometimes block these, and you want to make sure that they're open and clear. If you're using your pressure canner as a pressure cooker, which you can do, you know, let's say you threw a roast in there to just cook it quick for supper one night, grease and food particles can get up in this weight stem also. So how you check if it's clear or not is you literally just get right up there with your face and you look through that little hole, and you should be able to see very clearly all the way through that stem. Now, if there is anything blocking this, what you need to do is take a pipe cleaner, you know, one of those little fuzzy wire wrapped things, and just clean out your weight stem with that pipe cleaner to clear the obstruction. I do not suggest ever sticking a toothpick into these things, because that toothpick, when you're kind of working it back and forth inside of this stem, that toothpick can actually break off, and then you have a bigger problem than what you started with. So I always suggest to use just a pipe cleaner. Now, on your Miro canner, you will also have what is called an emergency blow-off button. Now, I have removed mine. Mine is no longer black. I actually had to replace mine at one point in time, and the replacement part that they sent me was red instead of black, okay? So this is not original. This is a replacement one. But that emergency blow-off button on your lid really needs to be maintained also. So to remove it, on the bottom side of your canner, it'll be sticking through here on the bottom side of your canning lid. You just pinch both sides and just press it out of the lid, and it'll pop right out, okay? So what I do to clean this is I literally take a toothbrush and, you know, just a new toothbrush, and I just keep this literally for my canners, and just scrub it really well with your toothbrush and soap and water to get any calcium or lime or cruddies or anything that's on that. Just get it off really good. And then, just like your lid gasket, you want to take a little bit of your vegetable oil, and you want to keep this thing in good condition too. Get it nice and kind of sealed up with that oil. This really helps them last longer, and it helps them function a little bit better also, because just like on your Presto canners, your emergency blow-off button does kind of move up and down. So coat that nicely with oil and then just wipe off the excess. And that will keep that rubber in good working condition. I'm going to wipe the oil off of my hands here before I place it back in the lid. Now, when you go to place it back in the lid, I go ahead and I do exactly the opposite of taking it off. I start from the top and get that ledge underneath there, and just set it right in there. Now you can see that there is just a little bit of movement on this button, okay? It's not as drastic as the Prestos, but there is a little bit of movement on that button. Okay, so now we have maintained our canner weight stem and our emergency blow-off button. So what about that pressure valve lid lock item that I was talking about that is underneath this handle, okay? Now I'm a right-handed person, and so I always put my lid on from the right, okay? And you line up, there's an arrow on top of your lid, you line that up with the space on your handle, and it will set right down on there, and then you just turn it to 1/4 turn clockwise and it locks on. But to get to this button that I'm talking about right under here, this is your pressure valve lid lock button. To get to that, in order to maintain it, I'm going to page the camera down just a little bit for this one, okay? To get to that, you have, at the end of this handle, you have a screw, and just take a straight screwdriver and loosen that screw up. I might have to set this down. Hopefully you can all see what I'm doing. Oh, now I lost where my screwdriver goes. There we go. Get that completely unscrewed. And it's a pretty long screw, okay? And hopefully, I'm gonna make sure that my camera is tilted correctly. Hopefully you can see when that handle comes off, you know, your screw will come out. Now, first thing, very, very important thing, this screw actually has a rubber washer on it, okay? Well, I guess it's not a rubber one, it's a metal washer. Do not lose that washer, okay? You need that washer. If yours is in bad condition, replace it with the same size washer. All right, now underneath that handle, this is where I'm going to try to get you a little bit closer so you can see what's going on. All right, so this is how our handle was mounted on our lid. Turn it this way. We unscrewed the screw, and now we can remove the handle. Now underneath the handle is the actual locking mechanism that locks your lid onto your Miro canner. And when the pressure gets high enough to push up this pressure valve with steam, you can see that this little metal piece rocks. And what that does is it tips it down into a notch, this notch on your handle, and it makes it so that you can no longer lock or unlock the lid. It locks it in place. So this pressure valve underneath here that I showed you earlier, this little guy right here, that functions this lever. It comes up when the steam when your canner is full of steam, it will come up on its own and it will push this lock down, okay? So in order to maintain this, every once in a while, now you don't have to do this very often on the Miro canners, but once in a while, take this handle off and just wash all of your mechanisms up. Now, I've never had to replace one of these lid lock valves. Never in my life have I ever had to do that. But I do once in a while just take, and I come in here and I put a little bit of vegetable oil on the top of the rubber valve here, and also on the bottom of the lid. I try to oil up this little rubber piece here too. Now this rubber piece does go all the way through your lid, and then the metal stem goes through that. And I think it unscrews. I don't know. Like I said, I've never had to replace one. But make sure that you're getting a little bit of oil on these rubber pieces here and here in order to maintain that properly functioning pressure valve. All right, now to put that thing back together, it is just exactly the opposite of what we did before. Aim you down here. You're going to make sure that you have your locking mechanism in place, and then you're just going to slide your handle back on and get your screw screwed back in if you can find the hole. There we go. And screw it back in place. I should have gotten a little bit wider tip screwdriver. This one is a little bit narrow. I'm going to turn this just so I can see what I'm doing, guys, but you get the whole gist of it. So we'll get this screwed back in. I can't seem to keep my screwdriver on that thing. Try to hold it with my other hand here. Well, isn't that the way of it? All right, let's try some light on the subject. Oh, look at there. That might work better. There we go. And screw that on nice and tight. All right. So I have my handle back on. I'm going to check and make sure that my button is functioning properly. Let me tip you up here a little bit again. Make sure that my button is functioning properly. Now it should work just with gravity. And yes, you see how this lever, this lid lock lever, is functioning properly? That's exactly what you want to happen when you're pushing on that pressure valve. Okay, so we are properly maintained. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and get my canner filled. Now your canner will come with a canning rack, okay? And if yours is secondhand and maybe the canning rack is missing, but you should have a canning rack. One of the main things that you never ever want to do is you never want to place your jars of food directly on the bottom of your canner. Always have a rack. Now, if you don't happen to have a rack with your canner, what you can do is you can take a thick terry cloth towel and you can place that in the bottom of your canner and then set your jars. Let me grab a jar here. And then set your jars on top of that terry cloth towel, okay? And that works the same way as what a rack would. It just protects your jars from the direct heat of your burner or your stove, you know, whatever you're heating with. It just protects your jars, because if the direct heat, if your jars are on the bottom of the canner without any kind of a spacer or a riser, your jars can break because the flame or the heat from your burner is just too direct and too much, and the jars can't stand it, and so they'll bust, and that's a form of what is called thermal shock. So if you don't have the actual canning rack that goes with your canner, now you know you can use a clean terry cloth towel instead of that rack. So what I'm going to do at this point in time is I'm going to go ahead and get water in my canner. Now, pressure canning works on steam, unlike hot water bathing. Now, air doesn't transfer heat as well as water does, and water doesn't transfer heat as well as steam does. Steam is actually the most efficient form of heat transfer that there is, and pressure canners are designed to operate on steam. Now, in a pressure canner, unlike hot water bathing, you want to submerge your jars under 2 inches of water. But when you are pressure canning, you do not ever want to submerge your jars underwater. You want the tops of your jars sticking out from above the water so that the steam can really reach it and work to help the heat penetration all the way through your food items inside of your jars. So Merrill canners suggest 2 quarts of water in their 12-quart canner. Sometimes I will put in just a little bit more than 2 quarts. As long as your water level is not over half of your jar, okay? You can bring your water level up to about midway on your jars and you're not going to have any issues at all. But Miro does say that it requires 2 quarts of water. Just because I use a lot of Presto canners also, I generally do about 2.5 or 3 just because that's what I'm, you know, I guess at this point in time, I'm just programmed to do that with all of my canners, but a minimum of 2 quarts of water. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get some water in here. And another little tip is that when you are pressure canning, a lot of times if you have hard water, you can get calcium and lime deposits that happen on the outside of your jars. Just from the, you know, the boiling process, and the minerals in your water can kind of create this kind of crusty, almost it looks like flour on the outside of your jars. To avoid that, people generally add, excuse me, a splash of vinegar. And a splash of vinegar really is only 1 or 2 tablespoons of vinegar that's required. But I personally no longer use vinegar in any of my pressure canners. And the reason for that is years and years ago, we could do that and there was no, you know, adverse reactions when we were canning. But since the year 2020, all of our canning items, our canning lids, our canning rings are being manufactured with cheaper materials and products. And today's new canning rings and lids really react poorly to vinegar. So when you have vinegar in your canning water in a pressure canner and you're working with such extreme heat, even if you have brand new, never used rings, one time in the pressure canner with vinegar in your water and they're going to come out corroded and looking just terrible, and they will never be the same. That finish comes off of those rings and no amount of washing is ever going to bring that finish back. And so I have really started just 100% of the time using cream of tartar instead of the vinegar. Cream of tartar still does the same job of keeping those hard water deposits off of your jars, but it's a lot less corrosive to today's new rings and lids. It's just a lot gentler. So it does the same job, but it's kinder to your rings. So in my particular situation, we do have a private well and we do actually have hard water, but we also have a water softener here in the house. And so if the water softener is functioning properly, you know, we've refilled the salt and whatever, it's working correctly, I can get by with only 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar in my canner. Now you'll just have to kind of experiment with your own water. Some people's water condition is worse than others. You can do a 1/2 teaspoon, see if that works, 3/4 teaspoon, see if that works, even up to 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar in your pressure canning water. Just play around with it and see what works. Like I said, as long as our water softener is working correctly, I only need to add 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar. So it really doesn't take that much. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get my canner filled with water, and I'm going to put a little cream of tartar in there, and then I'm going to come back and I will load the canner, and we're going to start the heating up and venting and pressure canning process. So I will be back in just a minute. All right, so I've got my canner filled with water, but I would like to just take a minute right now and I want to talk about canning jars with you. Now, canning jars, of course, you can purchase them brand new, and they usually come, when you purchase brand new jars, they do come with the flats and the rings on the jars. Make sure when you purchase brand new jars that you open the jars up and wash the jars, the flats, and the rings, okay? And the same thing goes if you're just buying replacement flats, brand new in that little tiny box. Please always open that box up and hand wash in warm soapy water. Don't put them into your dishwasher, okay? Do this by hand, but always wash your brand new lids. There are oils and different things in manufacturing facilities and plants that You just want to wash that product when you bring it home, even though it's new. New does not mean clean. So make sure that you are washing them well by hand and removing any dust particles or oils or whatever else that is on your lids and your rings and your jars. Now, secondhand jars are a wonderful thing. You can find secondhand canning jars at garage sales, at thrift stores, at auctions, estate sales, even on Facebook Marketplace. So when you are buying used jars, and you know, a lot of times used jars are actually better quality than the ones that we buy brand new. Older jars, you know, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the canning jars were actually made a lot heavier and with thicker glass, and they're actually my preference. Today's new jars are just not the quality that they used to be. So if you can find old canning jars, boy, I say go ahead and snag them up, okay? And a canning jar can be reused time and time and time again. Now, when you are buying used jars, there are a few things that I do want you to be very aware of. When you're buying a used jar, I want you to inspect the whole jar and make sure that you don't see any cracks. Now, a lot of times you'll see a manufacturing seam on your jars. That's not a crack. It's just literally, it's a manufacturing seam. But make sure that there is no cracks or chips or anything in your jar. But more importantly even than that is I want you to take your finger and physically run your finger right around the rim of the jar. Make sure there are no cracks or chips in the rim of your jar, because if there is a crack or a chip, you are not going to obtain a good seal. Some of the older jars do have really rough rims, and I can pretty much guarantee that if you have a rough rim, you're not going to get a good heat seal on there. But that doesn't mean that those old canning jars are worthless, okay? Go ahead and buy them because they make amazing dry storage jars. You can, you know, beans and rice and pasta and flour and sugar. You can use canning jars for a lot more than just heat canning. Dehydrated goods. I store dehydrated goods, spices. Everything goes into canning jars in my house. So some of my older jars that don't have a perfectly smooth rim, I use those for storage purposes for dry items. So always inspect your rims, okay, to make sure that they are nice and smooth. Now, of course, canning jars come in regular mouth. Here in the United States, they come in regular mouth or they come in wide mouth. Now, this is just totally your own preference, okay? I use regular mouth for just tons and tons of things, you know, soups and vegetables and, you know, just lots and lots of stuff, fruits and fruit juices. The one thing that I do like my wide mouth jars for is when I'm doing meat packs, and particularly bone-in chicken, because the wide mouth jar just allows you to be able to put in those bone-in pieces of chicken a lot easier. And it also is easier to remove those types of food items from a wide mouth jar. But I will share also that the wide mouth flat lids are actually a little bit more expensive than your regular mouth lids. And so if that is something that you need to think about in your budget, you know, through the years, you're always going to have to buy a little bit more expensive lids. Might be something that you want to consider. You can still pack meat in regular mouth jars with no problem. I do it all the time. It's just not as easy to get your hand in and out and get, you know, bone-in pieces into the jar in a regular mouth jar as it is in a wide mouth jar. Now, if you don't have the finances to go out and purchase a whole bunch of canning jars and you want to get started canning right away, I want to share with you that you can reuse product jars from your grocery store, okay? We all recognize a jar that looks like this. Spaghetti sauce, marinara sauce, you know, sauerkraut, what other things? Pickles, okay? Mushrooms sometimes come in jars like this, but I want you to pay real good attention to the type of lid. The type of product jar that you can reuse is the ones with the one-piece product lid. This is called a lug lid, okay? It's just a single piece. And I'm sure that you recognize it. You find these on your spaghetti sauce very often. And on the inside of these lug lids, there is a really nice thick bead of silicone or rubber. These are the types that you can reuse. Now, the only drawback that I have found with product jars is, well, there's a couple of them. I didn't mention it in another video, but a lot of times your funnel, you know, that you use to put your food in your jar, a lot of times your funnel will not fit into these jars. And so you have to kind of hold your funnel in place if you're using a funnel. But the other thing is that always, if you're reusing product jars, always keep the jar and the lid that came on it together, okay? Because different size jars have different size lids. And so if I'm storing these empty, I just always make sure that I have the lid with the jar. And I don't screw it on there tight, because just like with your canning lid seal gasket, you don't want to compress that compound that's on the inside of the jar. So I just really screw them on loosely, or just keep them in the same box or, you know, storage container or whatever that I'm storing them in. I keep them together so that I make sure that I have the correct lid to the correct threads and jar size. So keep that in mind. Keep your lids and your product jar together in storage. Okay, so the last thing that I will say is that whenever you are canning, you always want to match the temperature of your food and jar to the temperature of your canner water. So if you are starting with a cold product and a cold jar, you want cold water. If you have it room temperature, if it's sat out for a while you were preparing vegetables or whatever it is that you're canning, if it sits out for a while and it's room temperature, make sure that that canning water is room temperature. Now let's say that you have made a chili or a soup or something like that, and you're packing it hot. If you have a hot food item and a hot jar, you want to heat up that canning water and have it hot. Always match the temperature of your jar and your canner water, because otherwise the difference, the shock between hot and cold items crashing together for glass is devastating. It will cause thermal shock. The glass just can't take that drastic temperature change, and the bottom will bust right out of your jar. So make sure to match your food item temperature and your canner temperature. Okay, so I'm going to get these loaded. Now today you're going to notice that I'm doing something a little bit different, because I'm packing some raw meat. Now my raw meat, this really isn't a food item tutorial, but I want to explain myself. Normally you always have the same size jars in your canner, but today I just had some raw meat, and that raw meat had a lot of excessive fatty places on it. And so I packed my raw meat in quart-sized jars, which I will put into my canner at this point in time. But then I also had a lot of that fat, okay? And pints and quarts are canned at different times. Pints of meat are generally canned, well, not generally, they are. Pints of meat are canned in the pressure canner for 75 minutes. Quarts of meat are canned for 90 minutes. But since I had so much fat from these roasts, I wanted to save that fat to put as an addition to our home canned dogs food. And so I'm actually canning up the fatty parts of these roasts today. I'm canning them up in pint-sized jars. Now, these pint-sized jars only need 75 minutes, but since I am canning my meat also, I'm going to can at 90 minutes. And the additional minutes for these pint-sized jars is not going to harm them at all. But if you do use different size jars, always can for the longest, the largest and longest time, okay? So today, that's my quart jars at 90 minutes. So my quarts and my pints are gonna go in for 90 minutes today. All right, so place your jars in your canner. Now, it doesn't matter if your jars are touching, and it also doesn't matter if they are touching the side of the canner. That's absolutely fine. You can fit 7 quarts into your Miro 12-quart canner, and you can fit 7 pints in also. All right, so we are just going to take our lid, we are going to find that little arrow on the lid and line it up with the space on the handle of the canner. It will just set right down there, and then we're just going to turn it to lock it about 1/4 of a turn clockwise. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn on my burner to medium heat. Now, particularly when I'm starting with cold or room temperature food, I prefer to heat my pressure canner slowly. I don't just crank it up on high heat. I heat everything up very slowly. This avoids a couple of different things. It avoids thermal shock, and it also avoids excessive siphoning or overflow problems. So when you start with a colder item or a room temperature item, please heat your canner a little on the slower side. I do it over medium heat. Yeah, it takes a little bit longer, but it avoids a whole lot of issues, and it is well worth the time and the patience. So we're going to wait for this to come up to a vent, and I will come back at that point in time and I'll show you what a vent is on this canner. And we will vent it for 10 minutes, and then I will place the weight and bring it up to pressure and pressure can for 90 minutes. But for now, I'm just going to allow my canner to just heat up slowly, and I'll come back when the canner is at a full vent, and I guess I'll do a little more talking at you at that point in time. So I'll see you in just a little while. Okay, I am not exactly at a vent yet, but I wanted to come back and kind of give you a few more tips. Now, because the lid lock button pressure valve is underneath the handle, you will see steam come out from underneath that handle, and that's totally normal. If you see any steam or drips of water coming from around your lid, that sometimes means that your gasket is not seated properly. And before that pressure valve lid lock button is in the upright position, you can sometimes turn and kind of reseat that lid gasket, all right? So if you're seeing drips, just go ahead and turn it and see if you can reseat it properly. Now, once that pressure valve lid lock button is up, you will no longer be able to open your canner. And so if you're seeing steam or drips of water coming out at that point in time, you will need to just turn off your burner and allow that pressure valve lid lock button to drop down on its own, so that you can then open and reseat your canning lid gasket seal. So your emergency blow off button will pop up kind of on its own, just from the pressure of the steam that is building up inside of your canner. Now, if you hear any hissing or see any steam escaping from this emergency button, that means that you haven't maintained it properly and it's not popping up on its own. You can see when I push it down, you can see a little bit of steam escaping there. If you have steam escaping from that, that means that you need to maintain that button and clean it up and put it back in. So steam escaping from underneath your handle, that's totally normal, because your pressure valve lid lock button will force steam out of that area. So that is totally normal, but it is not normal to have steam escaping from your emergency blow off button over here. So at this point in time, we are almost actually at a full vent, because I can see steam is coming out from my pressure valve, and I can also see steam coming out from my weight pipe. So at this point in time, I'm going to check and see if my lid, no, my lid will still open. One of the big indicators that you are at a full vent with the Miro canner is that you will not be able to open that lid anymore, because that lid lock button will engage and you should not be able to open the canner. So when that button pops up and I can no longer turn the lid, then I will know I'm at a full vent. So I'm going to give it just a few more minutes and we'll come back and we will time our 10-minute vent. All right, guys, I heard my pressure valve lid lock button go up underneath my handle, and I just want to show you that now that it's locked, I can no longer open my canner. I can't get this lid off because it's locked in place. Now is when you start timing that 10-minute vent. We are at a full vent, and so we're just going to start our timer for 10 minutes and allow it to just vent for that 10 minutes before we place our weight on it. And I don't think that I ever really talked about the Miro weight. The Miro weight is a lot different than the Presto weight. It's kind of like a little hockey puck. And on this weight, you can use it for 5, 10, or 15 pounds. Now your 5 pounds, you would only use that if you were going to pressure can fruit. I never pressure can fruit. I only water bath or steam bath my fruit. But if you're doing fruit, you only use 5 pounds of pressure. Now for the 10-pound setting, anybody from sea level on up to 1,000 feet will use 10 pounds of pressure. So that's from sea level on up to 1,000 feet. Now, if you don't know what exact altitude you live at, it's very simple to find out. All you do is go and do a Google search and just say, what is the altitude at yada yada city? And just put your city or your town name in there and it will pop up with your altitude. Once you know your altitude, then you know that everything low acid, meats and vegetables, anything low acid that you can, will have to be canned at that pressure. So anywhere from sea level to 1,000 feet is 10 pounds. Anything from 1,000 feet on up above is canned at 15 pounds. And there is a 15-pound setting on this weight also. So these are actually really easy to use. So you're either going to be at 10 pounds or 15 pounds for all of your low acid foods. And that's another thing that I do want to mention. A lot of times you will come across canning recipes that just state 75 minutes at 10 pounds of pressure. Well, that 10 pounds of pressure is not universal. And that's one of those things that I cringe when I see instructions like that, because not everybody cans at 10 pounds of pressure. It really depends on what your altitude is. If you live above 1,000 feet altitude, you need to be canning all of your low acid foods. I don't care what the directions in the recipes say. You need to be canning your meat and your vegetables at 15 pounds if you're above 1,000 feet altitude. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes you'll see that in directions on canning recipes. And when they say, you know, can at yada yada time at 10 pounds of pressure, that isn't necessarily always the truth, okay? If you live above that altitude of 1,000 feet, you need to be canning all of your low acid foods at 15 pounds of pressure. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm at a full vent. I'm got my timer on. Once the timer comes to the end of my 10-minute venting period, and a venting period, I'll explain that to you too while I'm here. Venting your canner is really important because when you place your lid on your canner, you've trapped a bunch of air underneath that lid. And the venting time is when you're building up steam in your canner, and that steam forces all of that dead air out from underneath the lid. And so you're filling the entire inside of your canner with no dead air pockets, but all of it's filled with steam. So venting for 10 minutes is actually a really, really important thing, so that you're the whole space inside your canner is filled with steam and you get proper heat penetration through all of your food and jars. All right, so when it comes to the end of the 10 minutes, then I'm going to place my weight and I will be back at that point in time. Okay, so my 10-minute venting time is over, and now what I'm going to do is I can at 10 pounds of pressure for my elevation. I'm going to select the hole that says 10, and I'm just going to put that right over the weight stem. And I'm not going to change my heat at all. I'm still over medium heat. Remember, I always like to, from a cold process, I like to heat my canner up over medium heat. I just maintain that medium heat pretty much through the whole venting period and coming up to pressure period. Excuse me. Now, if my weight starts jiggling a little bit too much, I might have to back off the heat a little bit, but I know that better as the heat is, or as the food is starting to cook inside of the jars, and you learn how to listen to how your weight is actually acting. But at this point in time, all I've done is placed my weight for my appropriate pounds of pressure, and over that same medium heat, I'm just going to wait until my until my weight actually starts to jiggle and make noise. And at that point in time is the time that then I start my actual process time. Now remember, I'm going to be canning for 90 minutes today because I have those quarts of meat in there. So I'm going to wait until the weight starts to jiggle before I start my process time, because you want it up to pressure before you start your process time. So we'll just wait until this starts jiggling, and then I'll come back to show you and hopefully have you hear what it should sound like on the Miro canner, and then I'll start my process time at that point in time. So we'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay guys, my weight has started jiggling, and I just want you to see how it's acting and listen to, I guess, kind of what it sounds like. Now my weight does move back and forth just a little bit, but it's not spinning and it's not a steady hiss, okay? It's a jiggle. And this is what your Miro weight should sound like through your process. So now that I know that I'm at 10 pounds of pressure because my weight is jiggling, this is the point in time I'm going to set my timer for 90 minutes. Now, if at any point in time, while my food is heating up and getting cooked, if I hear this weight going too fast or just coming to a steady hiss, that's when I'm going to back my heat off just a little bit. Back your heat off in small increments and allow 3 to 5 minutes in between burner adjustments for the canner to kind of cool off just a little bit on its own. You never want to do drastic changes between high and low. Just back it off ever so slowly or increase it ever so slowly in little tiny movements. So I'm going to set my timer for 90 minutes and get through my 90-minute process, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how I cool off the canner. All right guys, so my 90 minutes is up. So I'm just going to turn my timer off, and then I'm going to shut the heat of the stove off, turn my burner off. At this point in time, you do absolutely nothing. Just walk away from your canner and allow it to cool down naturally. Now the way that we're going to know that it's safe and okay to open our canner is, remember how that lid locked and you couldn't open it. That lid lock button locks on and you can't open this canner. You wait until that pressure valve lid lock button has dropped down and you can actually turn that lid again. That's how you know the Miro pressure canner has come all the way down and there's absolutely no pressure left in the canner. You can't get that lid open until the pressure is down to 0. So I'm just going to walk away. Don't touch a thing, all right? Do not remove your weight, all right? Leave it as it is. Let your canner cool off. This, a lot of times, will take almost an hour for the canner to cool off enough so that that lid lock button drops down and you can open the canner. So, in an hour, after my canner is cooled on its own, I will come back and show you how I open the canner and how I cool it off just a little bit slower and in little gradual steps so that we avoid siphoning. So I'll be back in just a little while. All right guys, so I am back and I have allowed my canner to cool down. It's actually been a little bit over an hour. Now, like I said, the way that you tell if the Miro has completely come down to 0 pressure in it is solely by whether you can unlock this lid or not, okay? You can tell my weight is still on the canner. So if I can unlock the lid, that means the pressure is down to 0, okay? And there we go. The lid is unlocking. Now it's safe to remove your weight. And unlike the Presto canners where they have like these little plastic handles on them, or the standard weight that comes with the Presto has a little plastic topper on there. Those plastic toppers don't get hot, but with the Miro canner, and the AA, I believe, has this kind of a weight on it too. These things get scorching hot. Do not touch it with your hand after the canning process is over. Make sure you always use an oven mitt, all right? Because those things are super, super hot. Okay, so now we have unlocked our lid. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to lift the lid up ever so slightly, just a tiny, tiny bit, and leave it off to the side just a little bit. I'm going to turn my canner here just so that you can see. It's just barely cracked open. And we're going to allow that to sit for another 10 minutes before we, well, actually, we're not even going to remove it at that time. We're going to allow this to cool for 10 minutes, just like this. And in 10 minutes, I'll come back and I'll move it back just a little bit more and allow it to cool down for another 10 minutes before we remove the lid. So first step, unlock that lid and then crack it off to the side, just a little tiny titch, and allow it to sit for 10 minutes. All right, guys, so I've allowed my canner to set and cool for 10 minutes with just a little tiny crack in the lid. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the lid just ever so carefully back just a little bit more. And I'm going to allow another 10 minutes of cooling before I remove this lid, okay? So I'll be back in another 10 minutes. Alrighty, so it's been another 10 minutes of cooling, and now I feel like it's safe to remove the lid of the canner. Now the reason why I do this slow cool down process with those extra little 10 minutes of cracking the lid open is to avoid any siphoning that can occur. Now you have a super, super hot environment inside of your canner, and you have much cooler room air, particularly in the winter time, or those of you who run the air conditioning in the summer. Your air temperature is so much cooler than what is inside that canner. You can have siphoning happen if you just take that lid off right away. All of that cold air rushes into your canner and it pushes the food and the juice right out from underneath your lids. So to avoid siphoning and that overflow issue, this is how I cool my canners down. All of my PCs, I do the same thing. Just slow down that cool off period just a little bit more, and you're going to avoid a lot of siphoning issues. So after those two cracks and waiting times, now I can remove my canner lid and remove my jars. Now, whenever you are taking your hot jars out of the canner, please have a thick terry cloth towel on your countertop. Your countertop is also much cooler than your jars. If you take those extremely hot jars out of your canner and put them directly onto a cold countertop or a cold cutting board or anything like that, you can actually cause thermal shock that way. So have a thick terry cloth towel, and then, oh, we had one seal. Those are Superb lids. You can hear them. Superb lids are like the old-fashioned lids where you can actually hear them ping or pop when they seal. Superb is an amazing brand of lids, and 4 Jars are also another amazing brand of canning lids. But anyway, I was talking about thermal shock, so make sure that you have that nice thick terry cloth towel covering your countertop surface before you lift your jars out. Now, when you lift your jars out, I also want to tell you, every single canning jar has underneath the threads, yep, you can see, underneath the threads of the jar, there is this little glass lip, okay? And all canning jars have this little glass lip. And even your store product jars do have a little glass lip underneath that lug lid, okay? So when you are taking your jars out of the canner with your canning jar lifter, make sure that you go all the way down underneath that glass lip, okay? Your canning jar lifter should be under that glass lip. Never lift your jars just by the screw-on bands themselves or that single piece lug lid. Don't lift it by the lid, and in your canning jars, don't lift it by these screw-on bands. Get all the way underneath that glass lip with your lifters, okay? All right, so we're gonna go ahead and we are going to remove our jars from the canner and place them on a thick terry cloth towel. Now, even in that 90-minute process, I have at least 2 inches of water left in my canner. So that is plenty of water to get you through a 90-minute process. as long as your canner is not leaking steam somewhere where it should not. Okay, so now after you have your hot jars out of the canner and resting on this thick towel, you leave them for 12 to 15, maybe 16 hours. Do not touch a thing. Don't be tempted to come over and tighten any of these rings. Don't be tempted to be pressing on the lids at all. Just let them cool on their own. They will seal. And after that period of 12 to 15 hours, you will be able to tell by pressing on the lids after they're completely cool. You will be able to tell by pressing on the lids whether they have sealed or not. But you do not want to interfere or cause a false seal by messing around with your screw-on bands or by pressing on your lids while these jars are hot. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers it. I hope that maybe gave you some good information on if you've never pressure canned before, and particularly if you have a Miro canner and you don't know exactly how to use it. Maybe you inherited it from a family member, or maybe you were lucky enough to find one on Facebook Marketplace or at a garage sale, and you've never used a Miro canner before. Hopefully that gave you some really good insight on how they work and how easy they are to use. I love my Miro canner. I love my Presto canners, and I hope to share that love with you and take away some of the fear of pressure canning. So once again, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. God bless you all, and happy canning, everybody.